quote from you is leadership is all about humility, integrity, and generosity. Why those three nouns?
That's just been my experience over the 40 years I've been in the business. But humility is so important in leadership because if you become somebody who's too ego driven, you start doing things on your own without other people's input, and you suffer the consequences. Integrity is what it's all about. Generosity is important. It's an acknowledgement that you've reached a certain point in your professional career, and you recognize there are other people out there who could benefit from what you could do. Leadership is all about acknowledging that everybody's not on the same plane and on the same page. To give back is extraordinary.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors. Insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
Welcome to another Walker Webcast. I'm coming in pretty hot right now from having been at the board meeting of the National Multifamily Housing Council out in Las Vegas. So Bill, sorry, I haven't been able to say hello to you yet this morning. So good morning, and it's nice to see you.
Good morning, Willy. I'm happy to be with you. Thank you.
I have to say, I've been here in Vegas for the past 2 days, Bill, and I have had literally hundreds of people walk up to me and talk about the Walker Webcast, how much people in our industry listen to it. And person after person has just said the quality of the guests and the information that we share on the Walker Webcast is just a real gift to the industry, is I guess what a lot of people have said to me to sum up the comments that I've gotten. And so I'm deeply thankful to you, Bill, for being with me today, because I know what you and I talk about is going to be very relevant to many of the people here at the National Multifamily Housing Council and other people inside the commercial real estate industry, as well as people outside of the commercial real estate industry who want to think about careers and what's going on with executive leadership and AI and DE&I, if you can even say that word anymore, and a bunch of other issues. So I'm very much looking forward to dive into our conversation, Bill. The one other thing I will say is that to all of those people who have come up to me, it is really A, appreciated, and B, very flattering that so many people have listened to the Walker Webcast and get so much of it. One person walked up and said he downloaded 2 of the episodes on his way out to Las Vegas, and all he did on the flight was listen to them. But we had Mohammed Al Aryan on the webcast 3 weeks ago, and that webcast has been viewed by 492,000 people on YouTube. And so we sort of hit an all-time high there. And Linneman, who we did 2 weeks ago, is over 200,000. And Ivy Zellman, who we did last week, is over 100,000. So Bill, you and I have a high bar to clear today.
Depending upon you to carry it out, Willy. So
it's all great. Bill, let me do a quick intro. So people know your extremely impressive background. And then you and I can dive into a number of the topics that I just sort of rattled off at the top of the call. Bill Ferguson is co-chairman and chief executive officer of Ferguson Partners. Ferguson has 10 offices around the globe and conducts over 200 executive searches per year. Bill specializes in chief executive officer searches and board recruitment, particularly in the commercial real estate industry. In 2022, Mr. Ferguson launched the Ferguson Center for Leadership Excellence, the CLE Foundation. The foundation's program helps racially and ethnically diverse students by offering tuition and financial assistance, mentoring and coaching, and the opportunity to learn undergraduate degrees and secure promising careers in real estate and related sectors. Before founding Ferguson Partners, Bill was a managing director with Russell Reynolds Associates, where he co-managed the firm's national real estate practice. Bill went to Harvard College and earned an MBA from Wharton, and is an executive in residence at NYU and a fellow at UVA's Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Bill also did a podcast series called Masterminds, Lessons in Leadership with our mutual friend, Peter Linneman. And I was honored to be one of the CEOs Bill and Peter had on as a guest. So Bill, as I looked at your website and read the testimonials from companies like Waterton and Partners Group and Nuveen and Blackstone and Avalon Bay, very clear that A, your firm has an incredible reputation in our industry, and B, you've worked on some of the most significant and high-profile searches that our industry has ever undertaken, particularly as the industry has become more and more institutionalized. I don't expect you to divulge any names here, but just from a kind of a background, what's the best search and the worst search you've ever worked on?
Oh, Willie, there are no worse searches. There are only best searches. You should know that. But anyway, yeah, I mean, we're very blessed. I started the firm 35 years ago. And so I am as old as I look. I think our differentiator is the fact that we are just so focused on high quality work. It starts with me. And for people in the firm, they know this all too well. I'm just extraordinarily focused day in and day out on doing great quality work. I would, all the searches have positive outcomes, but I would say recruiting Ben Shaw to Avalon Bay has been particularly gratifying. Ben, as you know, came out of Seritage. Tim Naughton was an extraordinarily wonderful mentor to him and gave him the support that he needed coming into the company. Be mindful of the fact that Avalon Bay had never recruited anybody into the C-suite, no less ultimately to become a CEO successor. And Ben's done a great job. He stepped up. He didn't know the asset class that well, especially, urban multifamily. He was a Seritage before, Vornado and Brookfield before that. But he was a perfect cultural fit. Investors have embraced him. The board's embraced him. And it's been a very special outcome. So I'm indebted to Tim, to the board, and to Ben and the team for everything that they've accomplished.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
It's interesting. I was talking to Ben, and one of the things that I've always been so impressed with him is his understanding of the culture of Avalon Bay and the culture that was instilled by Dick Michaud, and understanding how that culture went from him to Naughton, and that he's now sort of inherited that. And I do think one of the questions I have for you, Bill, is this: when you think about recruiting CEOs into firms and you look at their educational experience or their education, if you think about their work experience, if you think about their personal skills, and then you think about their network, if you obviously all of those are important to giving someone the capability to step into a job as big and as robust as the one that Ben did. But as you think back on executive searches, if you only could look at one of those factors, which one would be the one that would give you the best sense about whether the person's going to be capable in the job? Is it on education? Is it on background? Is it on personality traits, their character? Or is it on their network and the people they know?
Yeah, I would have to say, Willie, it's based upon the cultural fit. And I can remember the first time that Tim and I talked, because Tim and Ed Walter were doing the search at Avalon Bay. And I can remember the first time I talked to Tim, and the first thing that came out of his mouth was he's a great cultural fit. Because Ben really wasn't all that well known among the investors. I mean, Seritage was not a company that was covered by a lot of the major investors. And so when Ben was announced, a lot of people didn't know him all that well, like they know a lot of the other REIT executives. But that goes to show you how important, culture is. And, we do a lot of work for private families. A third of the richest families in this country made their money in real estate. And when I'm bringing in a new CEO, especially a non-family member, to run a family business, the one thing that all candidates need to understand is the culture. And they need to understand that ultimately they may not be making the final decision on every facet of the business. And for anybody who has a problem with that, Willie, that just doesn't work. So the cultural fit is very, very important across private and public, I would say, hands down.
A quote from you is, leadership is all about humility, integrity, and generosity. Why those three nouns?
I'd say, and once again, that's just been my experience over the 40 years I've been in the business, Willie. But, humility is so important. in leadership. And you know this, you're a CEO and you personify all of these characteristics. But somebody who's humble and doesn't take themselves too seriously and thinks, to question other people, solicit their opinions, whatever, is so important. Because if you become somebody who's too ego driven, you start doing things on your own without other people's input, and you suffer the consequences. Integrity is what it's all about. Any strong CEO, capable CEO, integrity is going to be the backbone of who they are. Gray is not a good color. I don't care if you're raising capital from LPs or you're in the public markets. It's just that's a full stop for sure. And then lastly, generosity is important, Willie. It's an acknowledgement that you've reached a certain point in your professional career, and you recognize there are other people out there who could benefit from what you could do. And so when I'm interviewing people and kind of understanding their backgrounds and what's important to them, if they're involved meaningfully in a philanthropic or one or two exercises, it makes a big difference to me because leadership is all about acknowledging that everybody's not on the same plane and on the same page. And for somebody to be willing to spend some time out of a very busy life to give back is extraordinary.
First of all, we will talk about it later, but talk about generosity. You have been extremely generous with both your treasure and your time. And we'll talk about that later in this conversation. But if anyone leads by example, it is you. When you talked about that, Bill, it made me think about, you get a mandate for a certain search. And given how well you know the industry, given how well you know the major players in the industry, it would be my assumption that you, as you're sitting there getting the mandate, sit there and say, my top 5 people for this job would be this person, this person, this person, this person. And you've done a kind of a short list, even though I'm certain that your team goes and does a very wide search of sort of saying, who are the people from both in the industry and outside of the industry that could have the capabilities to do this. But I'm more interested in the next phase of it, to the extent that, let's just say that you have come up with 5 finalists who you're really doing the work on. They're meeting with the board. They're meeting potentially with the person who's stepping down from the role. How good are you at predicting which one of those 5 finalists is going to actually get the job? In the sense, do you sit there and obviously the decision is being made by the board or by the NomGov committee or by the person who's in the seat today who's bringing in their successor. And so you can have a lot of influence on who you recommend, but at the end of the day, it's their decision. But I'm just curious, as it relates to, as you've gone through your career, you'll sit there and say, I got 5, but I'm pretty darn sure that number 2 on this list is the one who's going to actually get the job. Is that a pretty consistent thing given your experience, or is it really that you're putting the 5 forth and these searches go in lots of different directions and end up potentially having someone on the list who you think is a very obviously capable person, or they wouldn't be on the list in the first place, but not the person you thought was going to get the job?
Yeah, there's a reason I don't gamble, Willie, because I'm really not terribly good at these things for sure. But what I like to do with the client is to once again go back and revisit the spec, and that's got to be driven by the strategy, right? At the end of the day, the next CEO has to be qualified to effectuate the strategy that's articulated by the leadership team and, in essence, kind of supported by the board. And what I do is I work with the succession committee in really looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each of the candidates. And what you find is that eventually through that discussion, one rises to the top. And, you take into account all the considerations. Now, for instance, in Ben's case, he was a sitting public company CEO. And a lot of our clients, when we're doing a public company CEO search, prefer to see somebody who has checked that box for sure. Now, Seritage and Avalon Bay are remarkably different relative to size and property expertise and whatever. But having somebody who's stepped into that role, who's run an organization, who's interfaced with the board, is an important step. And many step up candidates can, but many step up candidates can't, for sure. So, I try to make it very much of a mutual decision. If I feel a committee's kind of heading in a direction that doesn't make a lot of sense, I'll question them on why they're thinking about this and not thinking about that. But at the end of the day, it really has to be their decision. And you know me pretty well. If I feel like they're heading in the wrong direction, I'll ask them to come back and readdress. And usually it's a very good outcome. The other thing, what I think distinguishes us in the industry is that we can reference people very well. Like when I was, referencing Ben, okay, I can go to Mike Fascitelli, who used to work at Vornado, and I can say, Mike, this is the role. What do you think? I can go to Rick Clark, who at the time was working at Brookfield, and I can say, Rick, what do you think? So when I'm going into these situations, I have real firm confirmation relative to the capabilities of these people. And I rely upon that because, we use the Hogan assessment methodology. Our leadership consultants will assess the finalists. Our recruiters actually do a hour-long psychometric on the semifinalists. And testing is great, but it's just one piece of it. There's nothing better than having the network that we have and being able to turn to people whose judgment we trust, who work side by side with these candidates and can give me the honest feedback, full stop.
Understanding that a CEO search has all of those component parts that you just talked about, and both a lot of reference checking, a lot of interviews, interview after interview after interview with members of maybe a nom-gov committee, with yourself, with your colleagues, all sorts of people to try and, figure out whether this person is the right person for the job. I was curious if there's either a line of questioning or potentially a specific question that you have found has given you insight into people that you go back to every time. In other words, like, you pull me in and you say, hey, Willy, we're looking for somebody here. And you and I, you know me very well, and you could reference me probably way too well, given the number of mutual friends the two of us have. But if we were sitting there and you were trying to understand whether I was the proper person for the job and understanding that every job is specific and distinct, is there a line of questioning that reveals to you either the true character, the true intellect, or the true, personality of a candidate?
Yeah, the question I always like to ask candidates early on in the process is why they're interested. Okay. And that says a lot about a candidate because, first of all, it says they've done their homework and they understand the company well. And ideally, they understand what the role is all about because, people who are talented do their homework. And as I like to tell a lot of good candidates, your life is not going to be about having decisions to make. It's going to be about making the right decisions. Okay. So it's very important to me that somebody has been thoughtful about why they're interested. And then secondly, as part of that question, I like to get some feedback from them on how they assess their own qualifications, where they assess their strengths, where are the places where they're going to have to develop and whatever. So a lot of it at the end of the day is about self-awareness and really, just spending time with somebody and saying, okay, let's really talk this through because for your sake, for my sake, for the client's sake, we clearly want to do everything we can to make the right decision.
I've been grinning the whole time you've been giving me that response, Bill, because as you do, I interview a lot of people, and one of the I believe one of the most important pieces of advice I give to particularly sort of entry to mid-career people is that I meet very talented people who sort of would come into my office and sit there and sort of expect me to ask them all the questions as if it's a one-way street, got to show up, answer the questions. And what I consistently say, particularly to those people who, to your point, are very talented and might sort of have opportunities continuously coming at them is, tell me why you want to work for me. Why do you want to work at Walker and Dunlop? What is unique about Walker and Dunlop versus the competitive firms that makes you want to be here? Because to get in the room to meet with me, you've clearly passed a lot of hurdles to say you're qualified to do the job. So my questions aren't going to say whether you're good or bad for Walker and Dunlop. It's really to tell me why you want to work here. And I find it so interesting and insightful about your point of sort of saying, why do you want to do this? And I find so many people sort of feel like they just need to be responding rather than articulating what they want to do.
Right. And the other thing too is it gives you a better indication of who they are, because anytime anybody goes into a situation, you like people to be prepared. You like them to be respectful of your time, right? So whether it's a job interview or anything else they're pursuing in life, if they're going in thoughtfully and they're being honest with themselves, it's always a better conclusion, for sure. Now, the other thing I will tell you too, Willie, is that when we get done with a CEO search, we're adamant about doing onboarding. Because, usually if something goes awry, it goes awry in the first 6 months. And often it's a very innocent mistake. I'll give you an example. We were doing a search for a privately held, family-controlled business out in San Francisco in the office business. And we recruited somebody who, as a CEO, who had never worked in a family business before, which is obviously not ideal. But at the end of the day, you've got to pick the right candidate. So one day, one of the G4s calls him and he couldn't take the call, but he wanted to be respectful of the person. So interestingly enough, he had his assistant call back the G4 and said, so-and-so is busy. He'll get back to you shortly, but he can't get back to you right now. Well, this G4, Willie, was so upset that the new CEO didn't want to take the time to call him back and to understand what was going on. All of a sudden, we had something going on that was viral. And it went to the G2s, the G3s, the G4s, the G5s. And if we hadn't been onboarding him and dealing with both the client and the candidate every month, that could have spiraled out of control to the point where the person would have lost all their credibility and would have been let go from the company. And that's where onboarding is so critical for a CEO to come in. And there are a lot of things you're learning very quickly. In a public company, you got to deal with the investors, with the analysts, with the board, with your leadership team, the strategy of the business, whatever. And there's just so much to understand and appreciate that without having somebody by your side like us who knows you well, knows the company well, and just is checking in on a regular basis, it's amazing how many things that we've discovered and we've headed off of the past. So it's a big part of what we do and what we have conviction around.
You just talked about an incident where that tenure as CEO might have been, if you will, prematurely ended had that onboarding process not been handled the way it was.
Right.
The average tenure of a public company CEO is 7.4 years. Does that, I guess the question I have sort of is, and as having been CEO of a publicly traded company now for 15 years, I'm very long. I've been CEO of the company for 18 years, but I've been of a public company for 15. I feel very long in the tooth. But my question to you is 7.4. Is that because they've accomplished all they need to accomplish because they got into the seat just before retirement age and sort of say that's it? Because the jobs are so demanding that they can't put up with year 8? Why do you think it's 7.4?
Well, I'd be interested to have you answer this question. What did you expect the number to be? Did you expect it to be 10 or 5 or
yeah,
where
no,
did you come in on it?
I guess I thought it would be a little bit longer, but again, just because a lot of the CEOs I know in the real estate industry are in the seat for a longer period of time than 7.4 years. Mm-hmm. But it's a good, if you will, flip back. I think the other piece to it is I think it obviously does depend on both the size and scale of the enterprise that you're running. Whether you're constantly on airplanes flying around the globe, that'll wear you out pretty quick if you've got a global operation to run rather than a domestic operation to run.
Right.
Industries that are in constant change. technology being one. That is a faster moving industry. No offense to anyone in the commercial real estate industry, but that's a faster moving industry than commercial real estate. So that kind of wear and tear of constantly being on the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of technology requires potentially a different skill set. So if you don't know anything about AI and you were really, really good on, the last wave of technology, whether it was cellular telephony or whatever else, now all of a sudden we're at AI. And if you don't have that skill set as CEO of one of the big tech firms, unfortunately, your skill set doesn't match the needs today.
Right.
But, it was really, I saw that. And I guess because I've been in the seat for as long as I have, I sort of said, wow, that seems short. And yet at the same time, as you flip the question back on me, it's sort of like, there are a lot of demands in people who sit in these seats.
Right. Well, first of all, if I knew you were open to considering a career change, I would have called you before now. So, it's good to know. I just hope none of your directors are listening into the podcast for sure. Secondly, as many of the Ferguson Partners people who are watching this podcast would say, I am not the right one to comment on anything that's technologically driven. So I'll stay with our industry for sure. But I would say one of the biggest issues, which quite honestly is shortening the tenure of public company CEOs, Willy, like yourself, is just the, you can call it transparency, the lack of privacy, whatever you want to call it. We live in a society today between the internet and, your telephones, whatever you want to call it, as far as taking pictures, movies, whatever, the right to privacy for public company executives, in particular CEOs, is very stressful. And once again, it can be misinterpreted. But as I talk to McKinsey, does a study every year about public company succession candidates, and for the first time, I think probably since they started the survey, the interest level of those succession candidates to step into a public company CEO spot has decreased. And what that says, to you, to me, to anybody, is it is really hard to have any private time or to do anything at all that somehow might be misinterpreted. I'll give you an example. You probably remember this, but the United Airlines CEO was flying from, New York to Denver, and he flew privately at a Teterboro. Somebody came upon that and it went viral. And this is a guy, like all the airline CEOs, who was advocating, we all got to fly more and more and more because it was the tail end of COVID. Well, there might have been a very legitimate reason why he flew privately, right? But, it went viral, the board had to deal with it, the investors had to deal with it, and it wasn't a good outcome.
Right.
But for all we know, it wasn't anything that he did that was inappropriate. And that's the world we live in today. And I think a lot of public company executives, a lot of public company CEOs say, you know what, is it really worth it? Now, if you look at the tenure in our industry on the private side, the tenure is longer, both REITs and even further extended on the private side, for sure. So a lot of this is just the public company issue.
Do CEOs get paid too much?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question, Willy, for sure. I'll get Jeremy Banoff and Katie Gaynor on the line with me, and they can cover whatever I'm probably going to say incorrectly. It reminds me of the whole Elon Musk situation, right? I mean, his ask, most people felt was outrageous, but as Jeremy would tell you, the amount of shareholder value that he created, I think if you really studied it, he was probably worth close to that amount of money. The problem he had was the credibility on the governance side. He didn't have a board that was terribly well respected. The comp committee that he had didn't go through the right process. That was the issue there. But when you look at what he asked for, that number really wasn't all that outrageous, for sure. So I think you really have to go back and tie comp to shareholder value. And if in fact, at the end of the day, if those two don't correlate, then I think you do have a problem. But if they do, the reality is that's how public company executives get paid.
Let me just double click on that for 1 second more, which is just that. So I guess the way to ask that question another way is this: as if you're buying a stock of a company, forget real estate sector, whatever outside of it, and it's Bill buying a stock for his own personal portfolio, and you're analyzing and you say, I like the company because of X, Y, and Z. How much of a weighting do you put on executive leadership? So you're sitting there saying, this company looks like it's got some whiz bang technology, it's got some great market position, it's got some great, well, if they're a marketing firm, or a technology firm or an entertainment firm, let's just say that they are one of the best, and you're analyzing whether you're going to invest in them. They obviously have to have the ability to make money and continue to grow. But how much of a weighting do you put on executive leadership?
A tremendous amount.
Yeah,
for sure. And I'm not going to name names, but there was an airline this last quarter that surprisingly lost money, and a couple of the competitors made a lot of money. So what is that about? I don't know the full details, but if your competitors are doing well and making money, you really got to ask yourself the question of what's the leadership doing on the other side. Now, there might be a legitimate reason for it, Willie, but there may not be.
Yeah, I watched the interview with that CEO on CNBC, and I will only say that it was not, the answers to the questions were not exactly that strong as it relates to hang with us. We'll get it turned around in time. After having watched the CEO of United Airlines on A, record earnings, B, record stock price, and everything at United really cranking along right now. So other than the fact that Delta was ranked the #1 airline in the United States last year by the consumers and not United. United actually, I think, was 3 or 4 in the rankings, but surely from a operational and financial standpoint, United's doing really well these days.
Right. And what Delta's figured out is it's all about the customers.
Right.
I mean, if you fly Delta, full stop, you really feel like you're being treated. I mean, I boarded late one day, and the flight attendant came by and gave me 5,000 miles. I've never had that happen ever on any other airline, for sure. So they really have cracked the code relative to customer service. Leslie Hale, who's the CEO of RLJ Lodging Trust, who's profiled in my book, she's on the board at Delta. And so forth. And it's nice to see one of our own get on the board of a public company like that. But I really do think that Delta differentiates itself because of its customer service, and that gets back to the CEO.
I was going to say, you want to talk about a CEO who is, through the pandemic, held on to employees. Really, if anyone listening to this has the ability on a Delta flight, they in their document, if you're looking at their on-flight entertainment on their screen, go to it and go through the documentaries. And there's a documentary on what Delta did during the pandemic. And you want to talk about an exercise in leadership and how he led the airline through very, very challenging times, and why the flight attendants and the pilots and the mechanics and the gate agents at Delta Airline will lay down for that company. It's because when times were tough, they did the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really quite something.
Yeah.
Let's shift for a moment, Bill, to sort of the commercial real estate industry and the survey that Ferguson did as it relates to hiring and what that should tell us all about potentially the year to come, and a couple other things as it relates to capital. You all not only do executive search, but you also get sentiment surveys as it relates to how much hiring you're going to do. And fortunately for 2025, your survey of 170 public and private companies says that 47% of respondents said that they were going to pick up their hiring in 2025 from 2024, and that's up from 37% last year. As you go back and look at that survey data, Bill, and think about that as being sort of a predictor of an uptick in the overall economic activity in our sector, is that a good indicator, or is that sometimes a false positive?
Well, Willie, you never know, but I've been in this business longer than any human being should. So I have seen certain trends for sure. And I would tell you 23 and 24 for our firm, and I think the industry in particular, were as challenging as I've ever seen. And they were challenging, because of the capital unavailability, as rates shot up at the beginning of 2023. And then post-COVID, a lot of the property sector slowed down. During COVID, interestingly enough, and none of us knew what to expect, our business hit record levels. When you look at where interest rates were and the exodus to the suburbs, every property type was on fire except for office. Okay. And so these last 2 years have been very difficult. I would say starting, and once again, this is more US based, it's not global. But I would say starting at the beginning of November, we have seen a sharp increase in searches, just the volume of searches. So that means people are making decisions to hire, which is probably as good an indicator as you're going to find relative to their optimism about the future. But what's even more interesting, Willie, is we've gone from defense to offense. So 23 and 24, it was all about cash flow and value. And so asset management was at a premium. CFOs were at a premium. But when you look at the hiring statistics now, it's about searches that involve capital raising and capital deployment. And I will tell you, having practiced this art as long as I have in this industry, that if we see 3 months of sustained activity, it's usually a pretty good precursor of what's to come. And we see it about 3 to 6 months before it's self-acknowledged. So if you really believe in looking back at history, I'm thinking that, the end of March, plus or minus, the industry might be saying, you know what, and I'm not talking about a 360 change, but at least a 180-degree change where people are saying, you know what, we're raising capital, we're investing capital, the debt markets are better, and, we're going forward. Now, Europe and Asia are different. We have a presence in both Europe and Asia, and Europe is going through some difficult times. Parts of Asia are too, whether it's China, Korea, whatever. But in the U.S., we are becoming increasingly optimistic that things are turning in the U.S. in 2025.
As I think about the executive searches that you and your partners at Ferguson are doing, I think about someone who's either just getting out of college or graduate school, or someone who is in the middle ranks at a whether it's a development firm, an owner-operator firm, a services firm, a lending firm, some piece of the commercial real estate ecosystem. If you were to give him or her some advice as it relates to the most important skill set to gain to get on the radar screen of Ferguson Partners. In other words, they're sitting there saying in 10 years, I want to be on that radar screen that says that when they need to go and the hiring is going up by, 47% versus 37%, I want to be one of those people who is in that mix to get that next executive job. What would you recommend to him or her?
I guess, Willie, what I would recommend are a couple of things. One is go to an organization that is big and where you can be well trained. That could be a big private equity firm. It could be an investment bank. The advantages of the investment banking world is it does teach you, a wide range of functional skills, but it also gives you exposure to a lot of different types of transactions. If you go to work for an investor, you may not get as much variety, whether it's, an IPO, whether it's a debt issuance, whether it's M&A or whatever it might be. But the most important thing you should do is to try to find an organization that is well respected and where you'll be trained. And probably in about your 7th year, you will have a better idea of who you are. Okay. And, there may be a point like I was in my career where I said, you know what, I'm going to go out and try something nobody else has done. And you know what, if it doesn't work, I can always go back to where I was. But that's usually the moment of epiphany where the entrepreneurs self-select out, and they'll either go to a more entrepreneurial firm, or in some cases, they'll start their own firm. But there's some people who won't. There's some people who will stay with that organization, and as long as they continue to grow and get promoted, they may be there for 30 years. Or if there's a kind of a ceiling that they weren't aware of that, all of a sudden they've encountered, then they can go to another big firm for sure. But that's by far the safest bet. And it gives you the most flexibility until you really get to know who you are. The one thing that I'm amazed about is that, so many parents very early on in a son's life and a daughter's life, whatever. I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, you know what? They don't really have to know what they want to do because chances are they're not really ready to make that decision. You need to grow up. You need to live your life. You need to understand who you are, and so forth. So, my recommendation is, to find a place where you can be well trained, get a better understanding of who you are, and then you make an educated decision. It's a lot easier than hopping from here to there, wherever, which, at some point in time can become pretty disconcerting.
As I think about that advice, Bill, which I think is fantastic, it makes me think a little bit about Trammell Crow and the number of companies that have come out of Trammell Crow, the number of companies that have been. I was meeting yesterday with Mill Creek, and Mill Creek is one of the spin-outs of Trammell alums, and there are many, many more. What do you think it was about Trammell Crow, either from a size scale, learning, or culture standpoint, that it made that company such a incubator for today's many, many successful sort of spin-outs or startups that came out of Trammell Crow?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is they were very careful in their hiring practices. If you look at a lot of the Trammell Crow people back in the day, they all were well educated. And there was a process in place where they did hire people. And it was a process that was pretty much followed around the country, which is kind of crazy because this was a very entrepreneurial business. They all had local partners and they all ran their businesses. And quite honestly, they did very well. But they were fairly disciplined in the people they hired. And then what they did is they really allowed people to self-actualize. Okay. They made them entrepreneurs at an early stage in their life. They gave them a lot of responsibility. And for those who really knew what to do with it, they were very successful. The problem was that they didn't have enough of a governor, on the overall business. When people got highly leveraged, it became a problem because, as you know better than I do, the development business is cyclical. So, the reality was that they had some difficulties. But what's interesting was I'll never forget the day when CB bought Trammell Crow. And everybody said, "Oh my God, you guys overpaid for that. Massively overpaid for it." Well, look at who's running CB today. Bob Salentic. Where did he come from? He came from Trammell Crow. Look at Danny Queenan. He's running all the principal businesses, or most of them. Guess where he came from? He came from Trammell Crow, right? So back to your earlier point, it really does depend on where somebody was trained and their leadership skills. I'll give you another example of this, which anybody who graduated from Morgan Stanley who's on your webcast will appreciate. We have a wonderful gentleman who writes IP for us once a quarter. And we said to him, you know what? Then go out and interview a number of the Morgan Stanley alumni and try to figure out why so many of them are running companies today. What was it? What was it about Morgan Stanley? Now, there are other companies that have spawned great leaders too. But, when you look at Owen Thomas, when you look at Michael Levy, when you look at Colin Conley, you look at Amy Price at BGO, you look at Sonny Kelsey at BGO, you say, what was it that made all of these people successful? And you know what it was? It was interesting. There were a couple of different things. First of all, back in the day when they were all at Morgan Stanley, they weren't silent. So they worked on debt deals. They worked on investment banking deals, and they worked on private equity deals. So they had a much richer development and understanding of what was going on in the business. And the other thing is, they all developed a tremendously strong bond. So they helped each other, whatever. And, they've all gone different places. But if you talk to them today and understand exactly who's doing business with whom and whatever, they all continue to have these relationships and the partnerships. But I was just curious, to see what led to that, and believe me, and they have a alumni gathering every year in New York. I think like 300 people show up for this thing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But it does go to show you that there are certain cultures, and they hired right in everything else that developed leadership for sure.
Yeah. I think the one other thing to keep in mind on that, Bill, is if you will, vintage. If you and I both went to business school, and if I look at my class and other classes, either 5 years ahead or behind me, there is something about leadership opportunities, particularly for the C-suite, that there is a moment in time where you can hit that window or not hit that window, and then it's sort of locked out for a period of time. And when I think about the leaders of private equity firms, for instance, there were the founders of all these private equity firms. And then the Henry Kravises of the world and the David Rubensteins of this world said, okay, it's now time for me to step back and someone else step in. And unless you had the training and were in that cohort of probably a band of 5 to 10 years max and have that skill set, you're not going to get that job. And then once it goes to that next generation, it's there for the next 10 to 20 years, and you're not going to get a bite at that apple unless you go out and do it on your own. And it just, I think cohort does have something to do with it, that there's that mix at a Trammell Crow or at a Morgan Stanley of not only the breeding ground, not only the smarts, but then also there's a certain time where the opportunity presented for all those people from Morgan Stanley to go out and take leadership roles because they were in that time frame or age with experience to be able to go take them.
Yeah. It's like anything in life, right? It's a little bit of serendipity, a little bit of luck, right place, right time. No question about that, for sure.
One of the stats that your Ferguson survey came up with was bonuses, and it's bonus season. We pay bonuses in mid-February. Most companies, finish the year, do their books, and then do their allocations to bonuses. And I was interested, Bill, from your survey of 170 public and private companies, 61% of the private firms and 53% of the public companies that use target-based bonus systems are going to pay between 95 and 105% of budgeted bonuses for 2024 at the beginning of 2025. I hear that number. It feels about right to me in the sense that we are still working through the great tightening, and particularly on the ownership side, people haven't really quite yet been able to get on the front foot. And so the fact that 61% of private firms and 53% of public firms are going to pay sort of target bonuses this year. Given your comment as it relates to hiring stepping up and some companies getting back on the front foot, how much of a liability is that to the 39% of private firms and the 47% of public firms that aren't paying full bonuses?
Yeah, it's a very astute question, Willy, for sure. Yeah, clearly, if the hiring environment picks up like we're predicting it will, companies are going to have to start making sure that they're paying their people competitively, full stop. Because when you look at 23, 24, now, even though these people are being paid at target, if you look at compensation over the last 10 years, the bonuses for 23 and 24 are going to be at the bottom end of that range as opposed to the top end of the range because it was a tough economy, right? Nobody has done terribly well in 23 and 24. So we shouldn't misinterpret target for, a significant bonus award for sure. And a lot of promotes are underwater too, coming out of 23, 24, right? So, these companies are going into 2025 having been very conservative, and rightfully so. But you've got to recognize when the hiring environment picks up, you need to make sure you're doing all you can to remain competitive and to, in essence, make sure you're, making decisions on compensation that ultimately is going to allow you to retain your people. So there are going to be consequences for companies that don't acknowledge that we're going into a different period of cycle.
And outside of compensation, Bill, two other sort of not ancillary, I think in some ways very, very important questions on AI and the influence it's having on sort of entry level positions, not that you all do a lot of search there, but just the impact on staffing at the middle level of companies. Are you seeing downward pressure there? And then the other one is back to office. It's the big question that lots of people have been talking about as it relates to how do companies manage requiring people back in the office or allowing them to continue to work on a flexible work schedule. What are you seeing as it relates to that being either a driver of performance and people like Jamie Dimon saying, get back in the office or you don't have a job, or
Right.
others who say, you know what, we're going to play this a little bit softer and allow people to maintain the flexibility in their work schedule?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, on the AI point, Willie, I think it's going to affect our industry like it's going to affect any industry. And where it's going to impact the positions are situations where judgment is not all that critical, right? So any position that requires just the aggregation and analysis of data, those kinds of opportunities are going to be at risk. Full stop. On the back to work issue, I would say culture matters. Full stop. Now, are we going to go back to 5 days a week in most parts of the country? I would be surprised. We may end up going back to 4 days a week for sure, because especially for our younger people, they need to be around the more senior people ultimately to learn a lot of what goes on, what decisions are made, in the office for sure. So I do think that we will get back to, probably 3 days a week at a minimum, probably 4 days a week. I mean, it was so funny because I was talking to some of our people here, and I said, well, what do you think? And they said, well, people really weren't around here, Bill, a lot on Fridays anyway. I said, what? They aren't first. I was here every Friday, and then whatever. So part of it's the summer and whatever. But I think if companies kind of max out or average out at 4 days a week, that's probably as good as we're going to get. But we'll see. Clearly the trend, at least in New York, and we'll see if it spreads to other cities, is heading in that direction.
Yeah. It's interesting on that one. I was thinking about it the other day as it relates to in the professional services industry, broadly speaking, which you and I both are in. I do think that
Right.
there's this sort of sense that we're paying for a lot of office space and therefore we have to utilize it. It's just sitting there and you look at the rent check and you say, why am I paying for all this space if everyone isn't using it? But I was thinking about the consulting firms, Bill. And I think that, in financial services or search or other things, we, before the pandemic, sort of had everyone in the office and you were used to seeing them. But I think about the consulting firms like a McKinsey or a Bain, who, by the way, have exceptional cultures. Exceptionally tight, strong cultures. And the consultants are at client offices Monday through Thursday and then fly back home to their home office and come together in their San Francisco office or their, DC office on Fridays and see one another. And clearly they go out in teams and work in client offices. But I was kind of pushing my own thinking a little bit of sort of saying, McKinsey and Bain are fantastic companies that have had very sustainable business models. And yet they don't have everyone in the office, not only 4 days a week, they have them 1 day a week and have been able to sustain that for decades. And so I think to some degree, as people face this issue, it's important to remember that, one size doesn't fit all. And to your point, it really does depend on the culture of the firm. But clearly some companies that have been remote for a very, very long period of time because of the way that their work goes can maintain and build fantastic culture.
Right. Well, the other thing we have to think about too, Willie, which people they lose sight of, is that this generation of parents is much different than the generations before. I mean, when I was raising my son, for instance, I wasn't carting him all over the Midwest all weekend to play at baseball tournaments, right? Or taking my daughter to soccer tournaments or whatever. I mean, the life that these parents lead now with their kids from age 6 to the time they get through high school is so demanding that it requires, a partnership between husband and wife, spouses, whatever you want to call it, that's much different than when I was growing up, for sure, where, my son was basically home and we're happy to go to the the driving range or the, ballpark or whatever. But I wasn't going to O'Hare Airport, on Saturday morning and flying to Kansas City and coming back Sunday night after he played 5 baseball games. So that's something that we need to think about in running companies, that this generation of parents has, kind of a familial obligation, which I think is much different than prior generations.
I want to end, Bill, on your foundation and the work you're doing to try and provide opportunities for wildly underrepresented people in commercial real estate. I was walking through the halls of the Aria here in Las Vegas yesterday, and it is filled with a bunch of white males in blue blazers. And as one of them, I am appreciative of all of my colleagues in the industry, but the diversity has not gotten to this industry to the degree that it has to many others. And after our mutual friend Arnie Sorensen passed away, clearly prematurely from cancer, and one of the great leaders and one of the great people. And you want to go back to what you talked about as it relates to the 3 nouns on leadership that you put
right.
If anyone embodied those 3, it's Arnie. But the Marriott family making their gift to Howard University, and then, if you will, you piggybacking on top of that, setting up your foundation and working very hard to basically educate people on the career in commercial real estate. That a lot of getting talented people into our industry is not necessarily much more than saying there is an opportunity here for you to go and build a fantastic career, make significant amounts of money, and contribute to your community, to your world by choosing commercial real estate. And I've watched what you've done. I've seen how effective you've been at both raising money in your own money as well as third-party money to go and support these programs at both historically Black colleges as well as other universities. And I guess the question I'd have for you, Bill, is I know you have very ambitious goals as it relates to the growth of the universities that you're touching and the number of students you bring in. And I think you want to have 30 sophomores, 30 juniors, and 30 seniors. So you're getting a cohort of 90 coming out, and you do the back of the envelope math, that can have a huge impact on the commercial real estate industry long term. Where are you today, and what's critical to you getting to where you need to be tomorrow?
Yeah, well, in 3 years, Willie, we've raised $8 million. And I'm still astounded by that number. But at the end of the day, it's all about, our value proposition for these kids. And Arnie and I used to talk about this, because what happened in our industry is that all of our peers would go to Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford, pick the firms, and they go interview 6 diverse students at each school. And invariably those students would go to McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, and Meta. And these CEOs had the audacity to say, well, I tried. I said, no, you didn't. You failed because you looked at the wrong places. Those students are not going to be students that are attracted to our industry, as much as we might like to think differently. There are a few exceptions. So, the whole concept by our foundation is to develop these collegiate partnerships at schools that are off the radar screen. So it's Arizona State, it's Spelman, it's Howard, it's Baruch, it's DePaul. And we have developed these partnerships with these colleges, and then we bring the foundation in. And for the students who get accepted into the foundation, we give them tuition assistance, we give them holistic mentorship, and we give them career placement. And so we have identified the conduit to source these students, to your point, educate them about real estate, because a lot of these students are first generation going to college. They don't have a clue about what our industry could do, Willie. And so we're opening their eyes to the largest industry in this country, the largest industry in the world. And, if you're going to address this economic divide in this country, that's the way to do it. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be around to see it, but at least we're making steps in that direction. And it was all due to Arnie and the Marriott family and exactly what they did at Howard, and typical of me, I just plagiarized the concept and kind of took it in a different direction. And we are where we are today. So I feel very blessed. We have a wonderful team. I wrote the book. that's coming out in February 4th. Living Beyond Your Dreams, in essence, to show these kids there is a path to the top. And we profile, people like Tom Baltimore, David Kong, you name them. There are 24 CEOs in the book.
Jody McLean.
Jody McLean. And you can
Leslie Hale.
Yeah, Lily Dunn. You just go on and on. And so these students can read this book and say, you know what? These CEOs went through the same thing I did. And look where they ended up. So stay the course and never give up. And you'll turn out, hopefully in the greatest place of your life.
Bill, great conversation. Thank you so much. I had this conversation as much for my own information and education as I did for the people who are listening in, but I know that everyone who's listening in learned a whole lot from this. So thank you, my friend. It's great to see you. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for all you do, both for our industry as well as your new endeavors with the foundation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, my friend. Back at you.
Have a great day. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.